You walk into a room. The conversation is already flowing. Laughter is happening in the corners. People are filling the space with words and movement. And you find a place to stand or sit, and you just watch. Not because you have nothing to say, not because you're afraid, but because something in you is already busy. Already reading the room. Already noticing the tension between two people who are smiling at each other too carefully. Already sensing that someone across the room is performing confidence they don't quite feel. Already aware of the small things, the pause before an answer, the laugh that doesn't reach the eyes, the way someone's posture changes when a particular name is mentioned. You notice everything, and you say almost nothing. If that sounds familiar, this video is for you. There is a particular kind of person in this world, quiet, observant, often underestimated, who moves through life with a depth of perception that most people never develop, and many never even recognize. They are not passive, they are not absent. They are in many ways the most present people in any room. And today, we're going to explore why. Carl Jung, one of the most important figures in the history of psychology, spent much of his life trying to understand the inner world, the part of human experience that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't perform, that lives in reflection and depth, rather than noise and display. Jung introduced the concept of introversion, not as a flaw or a limitation, but as a fundamental orientation of the psyche. For the introvert, energy flows inward, attention flows inward. And because of that, the inner world becomes extraordinarily rich. But here is something that often gets missed. When your attention flows inward, stop noticing the outer world. It means you process it differently, more slowly, more completely, more honestly. Quiet people are not less aware of what's happening around them. They are often more aware, because they are not simultaneously managing their own performance. When you are not focused on what to say next, on how you're coming across, on filling silence with sound, you have a kind of cognitive freedom that allows you to simply observe. And observation, done with patience and without agenda, is one of the most powerful tools a human being can possess. Think about what observation actually requires. It requires stillness. It requires the willingness to sit with uncertainty rather than rushing to fill it. It requires a tolerance for complexity, the ability to hold two contradictory things in mind at once, without needing to resolve them immediately. These are not passive qualities. They are disciplines.
And quiet people often develop them naturally, simply by living the way they live. The Stoics understood something important here. Marcus Aurelius, writing alone in his private journals, words never intended for an audience, described the practice of turning inward, not as retreat, but as preparation. Learning the discipline of perception, learning to see things as they actually are, not as we wish them to be, not as we fear them to be. That kind of clear seeing requires silence. It requires the willingness to be still long enough for the truth to become visible. Quiet people often live in that stillness, and what they find there is not emptiness, it is information. There is also something worth understanding about emotional intelligence and how it develops. Emotional intelligence, the ability to recognize, understand, and navigate emotions, own and others, is not something you can rush. It grows through reflection. It grows through the practice of asking yourself honestly what you are actually feeling and why. It grows through paying attention to the emotional undercurrents in your relationships, your conversations, your environment. Quiet people, by nature, tend to do a great deal of this work. Not always consciously, but the habit of reflection, the tendency to sit with an experience rather than immediately moving past it, builds a kind of emotional literacy over time. They learn to read the room not because they studied it, but because they have spent years paying attention to the space between words. And that space, the space between words, is where so much of human communication actually lives. Research in psychology consistently shows that a significant portion of what we communicate happens non-verbally, through tone, through timing, through the micro-expressions that cross a face before the social mask reasserts itself. Most people are too busy talking to catch these signals. Quiet people catch them.
not because they are suspicious or calculating, but because they are genuinely paying attention. This is one of the reasons quiet people are sometimes described as perceptive, or even unsettling, by those who are not used to being truly seen. There is something quietly powerful about a person who notices what you didn't say, who remembers the small thing you mentioned once, months ago, who asks the question that goes straight to the center of something you've been avoiding. Quiet people do this not to unsettle, but because they are genuinely curious about the truth of things. Nietzsche, in his own sharp and uncompromising way, wrote about the danger of noise, not just external noise, but the internal noise of constant reaction, constant opinion, constant performance. He believed that depth required solitude, that the person who never sits alone with themselves never truly knows themselves, and the person who does not know themselves cannot truly know others. This is the quiet person's gift, and sometimes their burden. They know themselves. They have spent time in that uncomfortable interior space where self-knowledge lives. And because they know themselves, their own contradictions, their own fears, their own patterns, they recognize those same things in others, not with judgment, but with a kind of quiet recognition. It is worth naming something here because it matters. Many quiet people have been told at some point in their lives that their quietness is a problem, that they should speak up more, that they are too reserved, too serious, too much in their heads. Some have been made to feel that their way of being in the world is somehow less than, less social, less confident, less valuable than the louder, more expressive people around them. This is a wound that many carry quietly, and it is worth saying clearly. The way you move through the world is not a deficiency. It is a different kind of intelligence, a different kind of strength. The world needs people who observe before they speak, who think before they act, who notice what others miss, who hold space for complexity, rather than rushing to simple answers. Your silence is not absence, it is presence of a different kind. That said, there is one thing worth protecting. Quiet people, because they observe so much and say so little, can sometimes carry a great deal alone. They notice the tension in a relationship long before it surfaces. They sense when something is wrong before anyone else names it. They absorb the emotional atmosphere of a room and process it internally, often without anyone knowing. This can be a strength, but it can also become a weight. If you recognize yourself here, one of the most important things you can do is find safe spaces, people, practices, or forms of expression where what you carry can be released. Journaling, honest conversation with someone you trust, creative work, therapy, if that feels right. The goal is not to become louder. The goal is to ensure that your depth does not become isolation. Jung believed that the journey toward wholeness, what he called individuation, required integrating all parts of the self. For quiet people, that sometimes means learning to speak what they see, not to perform, not to prove themselves, but to share, selectively and honestly, the truth of what they perceive. Because the world genuinely needs to hear it. You notice more than you say. That is real. That is valuable. And the people in your life who are paying attention, they already know it. If this video gave you something to think about, consider sharing it with someone who might need to hear it. And if you want to keep exploring the psychology of who you are and how you move through the world, Inside the Labyrinth is here for exactly that. And if this spoke to a part of you that rarely gets heard, stay with that feeling for a moment. You are not broken because you feel deeply. You are only beginning to understand yourself. Subscribe to Inside the Labyrinth for more reflections on the hidden patterns of the human mind.